And I thought, wow, I think that I'd really love to play the saxophone. And my mom said, well, that's really great, but I'm not going to buy another saxophone because I already bought one for your brother and he has an old trumpet that he ditched. So you can have that one if you want to switch.
Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of April 8th, 2024. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including bands helping bands, a peek behind the curtain to see how this podcast avoids copyright violations, letters, we get letters, and I have a conversation with a band person who's like family to me. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. On the way to some listener contributions and a little behind-the-scenes feature and this week's trio section that really does keep it in the family, I'm going to note that tonight, April 8th, is the night of the big game, the climax of March Madness, the big dance, the NCAA men's basketball tournament. And I'm commemorating that event with 3 tales of athletic bands from this year's big dance, which went viral, and not a one of them involves a crying piccolo player. So, put your instrument cases back on the bus, and let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Spokane, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, and Brooklyn, New York. 3 stories with a common theme. From Spokane, with the Yale University Band unable to travel for the NCAA men's basketball tournament due to the university being on spring break, it was the University of Idaho Vandal Marching Band to the rescue. Idaho band director Spencer Martin was asked if the Idaho band could step in as a temporary Yale band. He put out the call, and the response was swift and decisive. Of course. The band held one practice, during which it practiced the Yale fight song and customized some of its own song lyrics to represent Yale. Right afterward, they loaded up and drove 90 minutes to Spokane, where Idaho was serving as the site host. The Yale Spirit Squad provided them with Yale shirts and gear, with which they caught the Yale men's team completely off guard. Yale center Danny Wolf said, quote, "I remember looking at my coaches and being very confused as to how we had a band all wearing extremely interesting Yale-branded gear. But for the University of Idaho to be gracious enough to come here and be able to play our fight song to the best of their ability, I just appreciate that." And from Omaha, the Creighton Preparatory School in Omaha lent Duquesne University their Junior Jays Pep Band for the NCAA men's basketball tournament's opening weekend, including the round of 64 game in which Duquesne upset BYU before bowing out to Illinois in the second round. The opportunity came via Creighton University, the tournament site's host school. The high school-aged Junior Jays had played at Creighton University volleyball and basketball games during school breaks, so they were ready. In just a couple of rehearsal hours, Creighton Prep band director Paul Ketchen taught his band the Duquesne fight song and refreshed some old favorite crowd pleasers. The band drew from their experiences in their home gym, nicknamed the Birdcage. Round of 64 fans and media said that the band were some of the loudest fans in the stadium. Tuba player Patrick McFall said, quote, "It made us feel really important. Just having a little part of it means a lot. It was a feeling of making it of sorts. We're like big dogs now." And from Brooklyn. Well, I saw a story about this which I thought I'd saved or bookmarked, but hadn't somehow. Darn it. But this is from the NCAA women's basketball tournament site in Brooklyn, New York, where the Duke University women's hoop team was competing. Some Duke musicians were there, but not a full band, since they'd had to divide their forces so that the Duke men's team could have a band as it competed in another location at the same time. Because I didn't manage to save the article, I don't remember which local college band sent some of its musicians over to the Brooklyn arena to shore up the Duke contingent. But they did, and it didn't go unnoticed or unappreciated. I mean, heck, it made the papers. That particular story did remind me of 2 instances from my own experience with college athletic bands. In both those cases, the bands I was associated with went to great lengths to cover 2 games at the same time, and those are stories I'll save for another episode. But for now, the upshot of all this is, college or high school, doesn't matter. It's bands helping other bands. This is what bands do, if they're playing the game right, which all of these bands are. And that's news and notes from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. Now we'll take a quick break. Meet you on the other side. More BandWagon in a moment. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, 7 episodes into this podcast expedition, and I thought I'd chat a little bit about the inner workings of the production end of it. Today, I'd like to focus on how I avoid being sued, which in my world means being very aware of copyright rules, licensing, permission issues, all that fun legal stuff. As an arranger of band music, I became aware of the importance of the concept of intellectual property rights pretty early. The occasional harrowing story of arrangers or band directors who ran afoul of the law in this area will cause a person to redouble their efforts to adhere to, basic rules of fairness and such. More recently, as someone who has begun to compose music as well, I've become even more keenly aware of this and supportive of just about any rule that protects creators of musical stuff from having it stolen, appropriated, and in general misused. Even more recently, as a church musician whose church gig has added live streaming of Sunday morning services to its outreach efforts, I have been tossed bodily into the pool of licensing. Because if you buy 30 copies of a choir anthem, you're legally covered until you need to send it out over the airwaves. Or whatever the internet's used for airwaves. That's somebody else's area of expertise, not mine. Series of tubes or something, that's what I hear. So, upshot. Stay on the legal side, always on the legal side. So, he hatches this harebrained scheme of making a podcast. He wants the production to be slick, or at least attractive to listen to, like the podcasts he listens to regularly. So he thinks about a theme jingle and musical interludes to get in and out of segments, just like SportsCenter, or name your favorite TV show. Fine, I could use pre-existing pop tunes or the equivalent, but I would likely have to acquire licensing to use them, and most times that's not just a one-time expense. In most cases, that's every time I use the tune, every episode, I get to fork over some dough. To be honest, it adds up, and I don't have that kind of dough. Now, there are a ton of little cottage industries contained on the YouTube platform. One of them is plenty of sources for copyright-free, royalty-free music. With the technology that's out there, there are ways for average people to create some pretty professional-sounding stuff, and they have. But this is being done enough, and people are using this sort of stuff enough that there's starting to be, in my mind anyway, a new musical genre that I could call generic YouTube filler grooves. Not really interested in having people listen to my podcast, but instead of focusing on the words, they're thinking, oh, he's using that backing track. I've heard that before. Also, early on, I decided I would like to have an audio identity for this podcast that doesn't remind anyone of anything else. On top of which, not a lot of those pre-made YouTube backing tracks sound much like band. So I thought, okay, I'll use band music, and being a smart guy, I will use band music that is in the public domain, whose copyright is expired. But if, say, the Dallas Winds put out a recording or a video of a march or other band selection, the composition may be in the public domain, but the recording is still the Dallas Winds' property. No stealing. What to do? Thank my lucky stars that I've got some music notation software hanging around, that's what. So I found some condensed scores for a few of John Philip Sousa's marches, specifically Stars and Stripes Forever, High School Cadets, and Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, on the International Music Score Library Project website. That's a great resource, by the way. I'll put the link in the show notes. That's an internet rabbit hole of the week for sure. From those scores, I created some arrangements of my own, and those are what I use for intros and outros and such. One thing that this allows me to do, which using pre-existing recordings of those marches might not have, is to manipulate them for specific purposes. For example, I can create versions that are loud to start with and then get quiet after a phrase or so I can begin my narration of a segment over top of them. The original marches obviously don't do that. This podcast's bouncy little opening and closing jingle is an original. Some other time I'll talk about the process I went through to work out the melodic motif that I used, but let's just say I own the copyright so I can use it any old way I please. Which meant that after having created that bouncy jingle, I was able to rearrange a softer and more pensive version when I suddenly realized that right away in the first episode, one of the segments was Glenn Adsett's obituary, and that bouncy loud band music was maybe not the most appropriate outro to follow it. I needed more of a Sunday morning NPR sound than a morning commute traffic and weather on the threes vibe. So in the process of avoiding intellectual property takedown orders, or worse, lawsuits, I was presented with a way of creating useful, flexible, legal, and ultimately unique musical accompaniments for the BandWagon podcast project. I hope you found them enjoyable. I hear them about 9,000 times a week in the process of assembling episodes, so the bright shiny newness is pretty much worn off here. But after the first episodes dropped, one of my community band colleagues sidled up to me before rehearsal and asked, "So, when are we going to record a version of the jingle?" Thanks, man. Don't think I didn't appreciate that for a bunch of reasons. All right, with that, I'm going to observe a grand pause, And on the other side of the break, I'll chat with someone I've known all her life. That's next. This is BandWagon. All right, let's modulate and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I get to have a conversation with someone whom I could claim I'm just meeting for the first time, whose resume I'm a little bit familiar with, whom I predict I'll know lots better after we talk, but those would be lies. My guest is, in fact, someone I've known for a very long time, and when we were trying to work out what the main topic of this conversation was going to be, I was imagining that we might just swerve in a bunch of different directions with tons of inside jokes, kind of like usual. But we'll try and keep it intelligible to the outside world, but you're going to know when I'm reading off my scripted notes and when I'm not. So please help me welcome my very own sister, KRISTIN Murphy. Hey, Chris.
Hello, yay! Thanks for having me on.
Well, before we got going with this, we were, as it suggests in my little scripted intro, you were noting that you were not a band director and you were not an instructor of a band and whatnot, because your major and your career,
I do the littles.
Your career is in education, but with people who might be able to physically pick up the instrument or not.
Exactly. Well, I do appreciate when they do pick up the instrument, but the only instruments that they pick up in third grade, because I am a third grade teacher, really would be stringed instruments. And I've become quite happy about hearing string instruments because my own kids play them, as well as a band instrument. We've all the instruments in our house, but my own students play only stringed instruments, but I'm thrilled when they do. And this year, for the first time in my entire career, at least up until I have 2 new students currently, but every student actually elected to play a stringed instrument. So I felt like I had won the lottery somehow, and that everyone could talk to me about music and playing instruments. And that was really fun.
And effectively 1 extra prep.
Well,
it's a bonus, but not insignificant.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that first, actually. It was a nice bonus.
So before people start wondering, okay, was he so out of interview ideas after 6 episodes that he had to go and grab hold of family members? No, but we should be clear about the fact that over the course of our childhoods, we turned into a band family and have never really looked back.
I feel, I don't mean to interrupt you, but no, that's the way it usually works. I do believe, though, that you are the reason that I became a band person. I think if you hadn't brought home your trumpet and, been playing in band and talking about band, I probably would have been interested, but I was extremely interested by the time it was my turn 4 years later, since we are 4 years apart. So in a way, I feel like I should have been first, but that's okay. I won't hold it against you.
This conversation has already begun, but I will loop back around to my beginning segment with a few lightning round band questions, which may already have been presaged here in any case. But first one is, what's your primary instrument? Not like I don't know.
Well, my primary instrument is trumpet, but my first instrument was the piano. I'm going to answer that 2 ways, but my primary instrument, the one that I pretend that I still know how to play, is trumpet. Unfortunately, the job that isn't in music really doesn't number on one's embouchure, but I do try to play a little bit.
Do you have a current band-related role?
I am like a band cheerleader for children. So I'm the person that's clapping loudly when my former students are playing in elementary school. And I feel like I am like a band mom, because my own kids have done band and jazz band and orchestra for that matter, but I don't have a formal actual role.
What bands have you been active with in your life, either playing or helping?
Well, I think the first bands were the bands in, where we both grew up. Grade 3 was the first opportunity when I was young to play a band instrument. And then I sort of never stopped. I kind of traded one for the other when I realized that, geez, the flute hasn't really taken. I'm going to switch, which of course was your doing as well, because I went to our mother and I said, I really don't think I'm improving on the flute, despite the fact that I am going to the lessons every week. So what if I ditched the flute and instead played the saxophone? Because I had seen a demonstration at the end of the year that our district would show students to try to get them interested. And I thought, wow, I think that I'd really love to play the saxophone. And my mom said, well, that's really great, but I'm not going to buy another saxophone because I already bought one for your brother and he has an old trumpet that he ditched. So you can have that one if you want to switch. And so therefore I said, okay, I'll give it a shot, and found that that was really quite great.
And you got a sound out of it weeks ahead of me comparatively. If we
Well, that's
put
because you blow directly into it instead of over the flute hole. So clearly that was not my penchant.
the buzzing appeared to come to you almost immediately, and me, famously, it took like 3 weeks for the buzzing to even work. So
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you a little secret in that I never really became like an official trumpet player in a way, because you're supposed to roll all of the red in to really do the best job of playing. And I think I do like a pretty good job of that, but I don't think I got like a gold star for that. So I'm working at it. That was a really long way around saying that I played in the 3 through 12 bands. And then when I went to college, I was in the UMass marching band, probably one of the highlights of my whole life, both as a musician and as a person. I feel similarly about the hoop band, which was the jazz band that played for the basketball that happened in college. I was in the concert band, actually, playing the trumpet as well, and I really enjoyed that opportunity too, because the repertoire was just a little bit more difficult than what we had played in high school. It wasn't obviously like a major band, but that was just very pleasant for me, and it kind of laid on the horn really nicely. And I liked that more traditional repertoire as well as the marching repertoire too.
as you were talking, I was thinking, well, this is a logical pivot into any number of major topics we could get into, but I think the one that I'm interested in chatting a little bit about, and I'm not sure we've ever talked about this specifically. There's always been kind of a lot of unspoken understandings, and yet there are a couple of questions that occurred to me that I think we have never actually talked about, but to do with with a pair of siblings or a group of siblings being involved in not just the same activity, which sometimes is contentious because, for example, the older sibling would really rather not have the younger sibling horn in on that particular activity. I remember I didn't care. I just thought, hey, we're in band. That's really cool. But in our case, and we are absolutely not alone just at UMass in this, but to have a couple of siblings involved in the same band program. The difference with us compared to a number of families that sent people to the Minuteman Marching Band was that we are 4 years in age apart.
Right.
Therefore, the first time that we ever played in the same band at the same time on the same field or on the same stage or whatever, it was your first alumni band.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was cool. But I think the question that occurred to me was, had we been a year closer in age than 4, if we'd been 2 or 3 years closer, and had we overlapped in that same ensemble, I wonder if that would have made a difference. Only in that, generically, not the two of us, but a generic 4-year apart pair of siblings, the first 4 years, the first of them is in the band out there on the field, and the younger one is in the stands. And then the next 4 years, the roles reverse. And in each set of 4 years, the band can be that person's band. And then the next 4 years, it's that person's band.
Yeah, that's true.
Am I reading too much into this?
No, I think it's, it is sort of nice to, in a certain way, to have your own space within an organization of any kind. But I think we would have given each other that space. I think probably we would have joined some social groups together that otherwise might not have joined, perhaps, because we got along and still do, as far as I know.
Yep.
So I think, that might have been a little bit different. But I think because we were both in the same organization, but repeatedly, but 4 years apart, we did get the joke. And even though, it wasn't the same experience, it definitely rhymed. That made it nice to talk about. The other thing about the UMass Marching Band is that really you went away, but you didn't really, in a certain way. You kind of parachuted in and you were arranging things for the band to play when I was there. So you would kind of pop in and out and people knew who you were. And even my friends, who were my age, got to know who you were too. So, it's a bit artificial, I think, to say that you weren't in the band, even though you weren't in the band. You were definitely known to the organization. It's just, it wasn't a daily kind of, on the field occurrence.
Yeah, I think that's the part that I hadn't necessarily thought of. That yes, periodically I would hit band camp for a day just to see how it was all going or whatever, but certainly not on a daily go to rehearsal, go grab supper afterward way.
Yeah. And if we were playing the same instrument, let's say at the same time, it would probably be a different experience than if we were playing different instruments in the same organization too. Also, it's a very big group, this group, but if it were a very small group, it might have a different effect.
One of the things that I think I was pleased about hypothetically as my senior year at UMass finished up, and then it was made manifest by me looking over and saying, oh, this is really happening. I had a bunch of friends who were not seniors who were going to be in the band again, and I was thinking, there is every possibility that my sister may end up hanging with these people. And there might well be people, I'm not trying to put myself up as a great person, but there might well be people who might be a little bit territorial about the friends. But I just looked at it and I thought to myself, KRISTIN and Basil are going to get in the same room and the thing's going to explode.
Yes, it did. It did. In fact,
For example.
I'm happy to go in and take my friends too. So, I mean, I pretty much married your best friend at some point. So, sorry. So, I was not bashful at that time.
An explainer for those who are going, qua? I knew my brother-in-law about 4 days longer than you did.
Yeah.
And it is too long a story, and it's not really a band story. But that circle round topic, which was the career that you did go into rather than something specifically band related, being that you are, with very few years worth of exception, you are let's call you a professional lifelong teacher of third grade folks.
I knew from the get-go that I was going to not be a music ed major. I was pretty settled on being an elementary school teacher from the time I stepped foot on the UMass campus. But many of the teachers and many of the professors, and certainly George Parks, as the director of the UMass marching band, they had stories to tell me that I knew I would need. I didn't even know how much I would need them at that point, but I just looked at every single thing that my professors did, most especially the person I always looked at, because if you have a huge band of 330 some odd people, you've got to have some pedagogy. Otherwise, you're not going to do anything and you're going to have a big chaotic mess. And I knew that from the get-go, obviously, because I had watched you for 4 years and him for 4 years. And I knew this is just exactly the place that I needed to be for so many reasons, but one of them was professional. And, I quickly decided I would like to be on the field staff, which means that we came a couple of days earlier and Mr. Parks just kind of like talked at us in a good way and told us some stuff and showed us some stuff. And it wasn't just talking. We did a lot of stuff where we were moving and, he was demonstrating. But one of the first things he said was observe, analyze, correct. And I was like, oh, that could be something that I need to pay attention to. And little things like that, I wrote down all of it as everybody did, but I looked at it again with a different lens. And in fact, when I think I was a junior, maybe, I took his marching band techniques class, knowing that I would never use it. I on purpose took it. I learned how to write drill. I learned how to write drill. And the only time I really ever used any part of it was when I was a first year teacher. I lived and breathed it as many first year teachers do. And we were doing a Cartesian plane kind of, like we're talking about, basically plotting points. And I don't know like how much time I had, but I borrowed some like soccer line paint from the gym teacher and I made one on the back field and I was like, I'm home. This is where I'm meant to be. I literally made one and people were like, oh my gosh, that new chick, what's she doing? And I literally painted one. And then I made little cards, which were like a version of our drill sheets, right? And I gave kids like the point, I'm like, you're this point. So you're going to go over 5 and up 7. And then I was like, our job is to figure out what we made. And there were like 20 kids in my class and I made a bunch of them. And so like, they were like, oh, I think we're like the letter R. And then I was like, okay, everyone, let's wave to the birds, like we're R, and then and they got, like 4 or 5 or I don't know, 8 times where we made different drill formations. And I think it was my way of being like, look, I used the class. I mean, not really, but I kind of did. But I took that class because I wanted to hear every single thing he said. And I took a couple of classes with professors that I was pretty sure I wasn't necessarily going to use, but because they were excellent teachers and I needed to learn the pedagogy.
For the record, I had never heard that story.
It's because it's a little weird, Rob. It's a little weird, but it was fun. And actually, my my students like are now adults, and I know a couple of them, and like they've been like, oh, remember when you did that? I was like, yeah, I do. It was a lot of work.
But they remember
But
too.
they remembered it too. Yes. And I hope that they were always able to plot points on a Cartesian plane after that.
I've done just enough conversations to now have kind of a usual thing. And one of the usual things to ask at the end of it is, are there any life lessons or band related wisdom that you have used outside of band? And clearly the answer to this is yes.
Yes. Aside from my little drill writing moment, all of the things that a teacher of marching band would need, the sort of like space is weakness, he used to say. So I always gather my students closely when I can. And the pandemic was, of course, the exception where I was like, let's get away from each other, everyone. Um, but that kind of information, that I learned the logistics of, but, I think the music itself, it changes your brain in a very good way. And playing music for so many years and hearing such a wide variety makes you, I guess, just more aware of the diversity that we have in life, both in music and also in people. And so I like to try to share as much of that with my students as I can. And also it makes me aware that I need to not just share my little sliver, but to
Mm.
listen to what their slivers are and to try to incorporate that in what I'm teaching and learning. And I also think, there are so many schools right now that for whatever reason are cutting their music programs and their arts programs. And now the district that I work in is quite supportive of education and music education, but I've been always that teacher who has been, the classroom teacher that says, yeah, actually, I am so happy that you'll take these students out and do music with them, because even though it's subtracting 40 minutes of my week right now, what it is doing is developing my students' frontal cortex, executive functioning, their coordination, their fine motor skills. It's developing them as people. They have to cooperate. They have to remember their instrument. And so that takes planning. They have to remember their music. They have to, remember it on that day. They have to find a place at home where they can play. All of those things are making my job easier. And there's a lot of research, which I sometimes throw in front of administrators who don't quite understand because they maybe weren't in the activity themselves, that suggests that it absolutely makes learning easier if you have been a musician or if you are a musician. So I'll be the one who, in my retirement, as I wave and make my little speech, I'll say like, and don't you dare mess this music program up, build it, because I want my students, that are third graders when they're 12th graders to have the best they possibly can as students. You pour the baby out with the bathwater when you get rid of arts in the schools. And I think it's a crime.
In the first episode of this podcast, I did a little piece. It was a whole lot of exposition. Here's what this is going to be about. But also, here's who this podcast is pitched to. And it's pitched to anybody who's been involved with band, which could mean band directors, but it could also mean, it needs to also mean band participants. And as much as music teachers and teachers in the arts would prefer to talk all day about how we would love it if arts education was teaching the arts for art's sake, it is undeniable that there are extra musical skills. And there's a buzzword that I was going to say, in the study and the carrying out of education, you've got more terminology than I do. You could talk to other professionals about it using all the right terminology in the right way. And I tend to say, it's because, well.
At the time that I graduated, there was the way they trained elementary educators is in the integrated day program. So it was essentially how you knit together discrete subjects to make a better understanding. And I agree that music should be enjoyed for its own sake, and children should be able to do it for its own sake. And you shouldn't have to justify it in a school program or anywhere else by saying that, everyone's brain gets bigger. So let's just, have that there. But the fact of the matter is music, and probably for that matter, any other topic, but especially music, because, you're reading music and that supports the reading that you do. That's
the whole brain is
reading
getting engaged.
Language. Yeah. It's easy to knit that one together, and it's essential to do that. You're like missing an arm if you don't have that piece of it, in my opinion. And other teachers may have different opinions. it does impact their program from time to time. But I like to think about things from whole to part. And I think the whole student is going to be much better taught over the long haul if they get involved in music. That's one of the reasons why our kids kind of had no choice, because my husband had a private studio and lots of music in our house and taught students in our home. And from the very beginning, they heard all of that and they saw all of that happening. They were early on really hoping that they could become musicians themselves. But even if not, I would have said like, hey, what about music? Because I know the great benefit. So parents of students, Kevin and I used to joke like, I don't know, should they do music or drugs? Music, drugs. Okay, music. So,
Well, loath as I am to wrap this up because this is way too much fun. We should do this.
I don't shut up. So you're going to have to tell me to stop.
Well, we can cleverly continue the little tradition that has been established for these sessions because a tradition famously is something you do 3 times in a row. Let me offer you some slightly less strictly resume-based lightning round questions, and one of them we've already taken care of. So what is one of your favorite pieces of band music that you played outdoors or indoors?
I like all of the Russian composers that weirdly got transformed from orchestral pieces into marching band pieces. Top of the list is Festive Overture. I liked Russian Christmas music. I liked all of that. Those are some of the best. I also liked El Boro and all the sort of
Latin chop busters.
All of those. Loved all of those. And in concert band, there was a piece called Incantation and Dance, which I don't know why I remember that years later. Literally, I don't know why, but I loved that piece. And I played in a district band, one of the few that I got into, another orchestra piece that they made probably a band, into a band one, which is Enigma and Variations. I love those pieces for orchestra that translate to band, whether it's on the field or not.
Having overheard you talk about the Enigma Variations, there was one year in drum corps where for some reason, I have to think it was a coincidence, but at least half a dozen corps incorporated that into their shows. And every time I saw one of them on the quarterfinals at the movies, DCI session there, I was sitting in a movie theater and here comes another application of the Enigma Variations melody. And I thought of you instantly.
Yep.
Okay, so what's a piece of band music that you haven't played, but you would like to?
I've never played, to my knowledge, that I remember anything like Bernstein. So Candide, West Side Story. I don't think I've ever actually played it. I listened to my kids play it, but that's one that I think that would be a full body experience that I wish I had had. That, and I think also like Copeland, Fanfare for the Common Man. I would love to actually play that as well.
Speaking as a trumpet player.
Well, that's why.
Is there a band that you'd love to perform with that you haven't, either because you're at the right age or you're in the right place or you don't live in the right century?
I think I would really love to play in, that Tommy Dorsey band kind of thing. I just wonder what that was. I mean, being female, I don't know if they did that. I actually have to figure out whether that was even a thing back then, but I would love to have just heard what they were saying and be part of that, whole big band era. When you invite me on for the second time, after everyone else has had a turn in about 10 years, it'll be interesting to talk about being a girl in a traditionally male section, as I was for all those years playing the trumpet. That's got a lot of good stories too. Yep. When you interview everyone else, then you come back to me. That's what we'll talk about next time.
And to wrap up, since my very last question, we did half the session on. Tell me one of your favorite band stories.
One of my favorite band stories is when I was going to band camp and I was going to be a freshman. I think you probably were there dropping me off, and I don't know, maybe my parents too, but I think it was just you. And I walked up and got, keys to my room or whatever, and walked in and I looked and my roommate was a flute player, and I was like, oh, flute player. Okay, well, that's good. It'll be fine. And she later told me that she came back later when I wasn't in the room and she was looking at the stuff and she realized I was a trumpet player. She's like, oh, a trumpet player. Oh no, no. And when we met, we realized perhaps we were separated birth sisters. I don't know, but we connected immediately and we were just the closest of friends for our whole time. And she was in my wedding, and we always laugh about that, but I think band is one of the many places where we can bust up those stereotypes and realize that the person behind the instrument or whatever is the person, and those stereotypes need to be gone. So my favorite story is that, you can't judge a book by its cover and you can't judge a person by their instrument. So
except for tuba players. That's
no, I like them too.
Well, as we record this, you are on school break.
Yes, that's why I'm energetic and still awake. Yes, in fact.
This interview may appear shortly thereafter, he says with frank understatement, but every podcast interview seems to end with the question, is there somewhere, where can we find you online? And one caveat about that I always take into account is that I don't know how many teachers are really enthusiastic about having the entire world descend upon their teaching gig. But I wonder if there's a place where you would love to have people find you. And
yeah, indeed. Well, I do love fan mail, but but you can find me. I've been experimenting with podcasts too, and it looks like you're doing a probably more polished and better job than I am currently. Although I do like the 4 little podcasts that have come together over the last, I don't know, year or two. So you can find me at Think, Pair, Teacher, Share. I'm on Spotify and a bunch of other nifty platforms. So I hope you'll take a moment and take a peek. That's a little endeavor where I like to combine storytelling with teaching, but also just make it applicable for whomever, not just teachers. So hopefully you'll enjoy that.
And even though I have said that I don't have any of the terminology, I do have at least the knowledge that Think, Pair, Share is a collaborative learning strategy. That I remember.
Yes, indeed. I'm glad you got the joke.
I remember from a professional development session that I had, and I remember thinking, not sure where I'm going to use this exactly in teaching beginner instruments, but never say never.
Exactly. We can all cooperate because music is about cooperation.
Yes. Teacher, podcaster, research nerd, sister, KRISTIN Murphy, thanks so much for chatting with me. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Okay, one last break and then we'll head for the big finish. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with me. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight is another band-related internet rabbit hole of the week. Where I offer one of my online excursions that you might be inspired to pursue yourself. This week's rabbit hole of the week is a single YouTube channel. It's called Music213, M-U-S-I-C and the numbers 213, right in a row. If you haven't run into it, it's a goldmine. Its sole purpose is to post short videos of bands that participate in parades associated with holidays and bowl games. So, band performances from the Rose Parade and its associated BandFest event, where the bands get to perform their field shows and then pass in review with their parade selections, as an example. Not much more to say about this, except this one thing. The video clips from the Rose Parade do not contain any announcer voiceovers. I'm sure it's not just my pet peeve. I tune into parade coverage, whether it's the Rose or Macy's or whatever, and I want to hear the bands do their thing. I don't need Al Roker or whomever trying to promote some upcoming network sitcom or something. People in those bands have worked too hard to prepare for those performances for talking heads to read copy over top of them. I have spoken. So Music 213 is what I've been looking forward to pretty much since I was in junior high, and I thank them for existing. You'll thank them too, I think. Okay, one last pause to catch our breath, and then we'll wrap things up for the week. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the CODA. For the CODA this week, the first in what I hope will be a long-running series of letters to the editor. I asked, you answered. First up, from Tom, and full disclosure, I have known this gentleman for quite literally 40 years. Rob, what a great start to this podcast business. You might have something here. Thank you kindly, humble curtsy. Tom continues, culture before technique. There's a starred thought for us all. A couple of weeks ago, the MPH student in my office interviewed me about leadership for a class. A 15-minute interview turned into an hour-long discussion about leadership. I never even spoke about the roots of my leadership training, band. But I have just realized that any success I have had leading teams is about how we developed the culture behind the work we did. I use a lot of starred thoughts in my life. This will be added to them. Yeah, the longer this little podcast project goes on, the more of those bits of wisdom are going to get mentioned, those starred thoughts. I kind of cheat when I ask my interview subjects if there are any bits of band wisdom that have stuck with them, but even without that, I feel like those starred thoughts will come up anyway. Next up, and finally, from Anonymous. I was introduced to your podcast from the contact page you sent to the Daily Beans today. Oh, sorry. A quick bit of background to this by way of an explainer. One of the podcasts that I listen to is a daily news aggregation and analysis podcast called The Daily Beans. And to make a long story short, too late, that podcast has informed me quite a bit with regard to how a podcast should sound. So I wrote them a letter to the editor, since they close each of their podcast episodes with a segment that includes listeners writing in, sharing various kinds of good news. My letter was a shout-out to them. I thank them for being, in no small way, a role model for me, a wee rookie podcaster. And sure enough, my letter got read, on the air, if you will. And the podcast host recalled her early days and the podcast she listened to for inspiration and ideas, and she had a little moment of perspective. Selfishly, I did kind of hope that perhaps some Daily Beans listeners might become bandwagon listeners too. My pie-in-the-sky hope was that the Daily Beans co-host, who's a stand-up comedian in real life, might become a bandwagon listener as well, because occasionally she told stories about being the center snare drummer in her high school band's drumline. Who knows? But at the very least, it's important to thank people when you get the chance. And sure enough, I received this email from Anonymous the very afternoon after my letter was read on the Daily Beans podcast. So Anonymous writes, I was introduced to your podcast from the contact page you sent to the Daily Beans today, listening while I and my fur buddy were out for our daily walk. We were about half a mile out when she, the podcast host, read your life dream of starting a podcast for band geeks, and I shouted, finally! My dog looked up at me like I was totally insane, but decided that since I was still walking and still had his treat bag, things were okay to continue. Anyway, I've been playing drums forever and was in my high school marching and concert band, and I knew that I was in heaven. My high school band did a lot of local events, and we were the first marching band to introduce the first Long Beach Grand Prix in Long Beach, California. After graduation, I was working and was starting to decide what college I could get into with a great band. I was lining myself up to get into USC, which has one of the best marching bands in the U.S., when my family was tossed into a disaster when my grandparents were involved in a freeway head-on collision with a drunk driver in Ojai, California. They nearly died, except for the 2 California Highway Patrol officers who were first on the scene and saved my grandparents' lives. A few days later, I met a couple of CHP officers and described what had happened and started asking a lot of questions about their training and such. They provided a phone number for CHP recruiting, and I thanked them for their time. Immediately, I took my lunch break calling that number, and exactly a year later, I was hired by the CHP, where I spent the next 30 years doing, at least to me, the best career ever. So, making a long story short, I've always been, and still am, a band geek. It's one of those things that once it's in your blood, it's there for your lifetime. I am so glad that you started this podcast so we band geeks can listen to and talk to people who understand what we're talking about. It's the same as when a bunch of old, crusty, retired law enforcement officers get together and compare war stories. Thank you for figuring out how this podcast thing works and giving me another happy place to go to for a little while. Anonymous, it is my pleasure, and this is what I'm talking about, people. If you've got a story like that, or any band story really, you know what to do. And how to do it is on the other side of this jingle. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at our website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback, be polite, but let me know what you like, what you think might change. Tell me your best band story, or suggest a topic for a future episode, whatever you like. You can do that using our email address, heybandwagon@yahoo.com. Or leave us a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that we do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. All those contact links and links to our news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, KRISTIN Murphy, can be found in our show notes. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoyed this podcast, get someone else to listen as well. As it turns out, word of mouth is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with us every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please give us a 5-star review. It really helps other people to find the show. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do all this again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton, and remember, be careful who you tell those trumpet player jokes near. I'm just saying.